Hey everybody, Mike and Hannah here with Delta Faucet. If you're watching this video, you probably just completed the installation of your Delta Classic 500 tub or shower base. So let's get ready to finish off this project.
If you haven't installed those yet, check out our videos first. Also, before starting any plumbing related project, it's always a good idea to shut off the water supply. So do that before starting the installation.
Now before we get started, we want to make sure that you're watching the right video, so let's take a second to confirm a few things. First, take a look at your installation guide or your packaging to confirm which series you've selected. Now this video will cover the installation of the Delta Classic 500 60x32 tile bathtub wall set. But keep in mind, the steps are exactly the same for the Delta Classic 500 60x32 tile shower wall set.
The size will affect your installation, so double check that packaging or installation guide. If you're installing the 48x34, 36x36, or 32x32, don't worry, we have a different video for you. Finally, there are a lot of different options here on how to finish up this project, like adding doors or a shower curtain. If you decide to go the door route, take a look at the instructions for details on adding additional framing.
Now, if you're ready to install the wall set, let's get the disclaimers out of the way. This project isn't terribly difficult, but it does take some time to get through. Also, it's good to note that this is a two-person job because there are certainly some steps along the way that require an extra set of hands.
Also keep in mind that building codes are different everywhere. So if there's a task that seems a bit beyond your abilities, we definitely recommend contacting a professional. You can also make sure that you're comfortable with these steps by reviewing this video before fully diving in. One thing to note, we'll be using a dual-purpose polymer adhesive and sealant for our install. However, you can also use construction adhesive that's labeled safe for plastic and an advanced waterproof sealant.
All right, let's collect the tools and supplies we're gonna need to complete this installation. You'll need a drill, some safety glasses, a caulk gun, some adhesive, some sealant, a tape measure, some gloves, a level, a carpenter's square, maybe some shims, a drop cloth, a pencil, a utility knife, some construction screws that are 2.5 inches long, 1.25 inch stainless or zinc plated truss head screws, a bit holder extension, a 3/16 of an inch drill bit, a driver bit, maybe some 2x4 and 2x6 lumber for some additional framing, and a hole saw. All right, once you have all those things collected, let's get started. Here we are in our tub alcove, ready to start the installation. Now the first step is going to be adding some additional blocking to our existing framing to help support our wall set. Now this blocking is going to be in 4 total locations. 1 piece of blocking in between the middle stud bay on each side, and then 2 pieces of blocking in between the 2 middle stud bays along the back wall. Now a few things to know about this blocking. You can use either 1x4 or 2x4 material. However, I recommend using the 2x4 material because it gives you a little bit of additional width there when we're securing it to the existing framing, helping ensure that blocking doesn't split and you're getting a good, strong connection. Second, all of our blocking wants to be installed perfectly flush with the existing framing, so nothing sticking out or a little bit recessed there. And then finally, the location and position of the blocking is extremely important, so just pay attention to these measurements. For the sides, we're going to be installing our blocking 50 3/8 of an inch off of the subfloor. So I'm going to be taking my tape measure here, making sure I'm contacting the subfloor behind the tub and not that bottom plate, and then making a reference line at 50 3/8 of an inch. I repeat the same thing for the other side here. Again, making sure I'm on the subfloor, and then 50 3/8 of an inch. All right, now I'm gonna repeat the same measurements for the other side, and along the back wall, I wanna note that the height is gonna be slightly different. This is gonna be only 48 inches off of the subfloor. So I'm gonna take my tape measure, again, making sure I'm coming in contact with that subfloor down below and not the bottom plate, and then make a reference line at 48 of an inch on each side of where I'm installing that blocking. All right, now that I have all those positions marked, I can go ahead and install my blocking. Now I do want to point out that if you're installing this on a shower base, there are going to be 2 additional spots of blocking that we need to add. All these 4 are going to be exactly the same, however, we're going to be installing 2 pieces of blocking, 1 on each side, down lower behind the wall set. This is going to be 17 inches up off of the subfloor, again in that middle stud bay on each side. So just take a moment to go ahead and install those 2 extra pieces of blocking if you are installing that shower wall set. Next, we can move on to installing our door nailers. Now what door nailers are is a little bit of additional framing that we're going to attach to our existing opening to provide the support necessary for installing a shower door system once your wall set is all installed. So if you're planning on installing only a shower curtain in your opening, you could technically skip this step. However, I strongly recommend going ahead and adding these anyway. That way you're kind of future-proofing your install, so if you change your mind down the road, you've got everything you need to install that shower door system. Now these door nailers are going to be out of 2x6 framing material like I have here. And again, just like the blocking, there are going to be some important measurements to remember. Now for my tub install, these door nailers are going to be 57 inches high. If I was installing the same thing on a shower base, I'd want to make sure that this distance was 69.5 inches high. I'm going to be installing 2 nailers per side, so 2 on this side and 2 on the other, so for 4 total. And just like the blocking, the vertical and horizontal position of this nailer is going to be important. I'll kind of show you how this is going to dry fit first. It's going to attach to the back side of this 2x4 framing here that I've got my flange on for my tub. And the 2 important measurements here are making sure that the bottom of my door nailer is going to be sitting 1 inch off of the flange of my tub, and also that the reveal of the door nailer, that's the horizontal position here, is going to be 2 3/16 of an inch. So I think it's the easiest to make some of these reference marks before we actually install the door nailer. I'm going to set that off to the side. And the first thing I'm going to do is make a reference mark above the flange of my tub here, again at 1 inch. That'll help me determine my vertical position. Now another note here is if I'm installing this on a shower base, that measurement is going to be 5/8 of an inch. So once I get my vertical position here, next I want to determine my horizontal position on my door nailer. That's going to be 2 3/16 of an inch. And I like to add a reference mark, one at the top and one at the bottom, and that way I can keep an eye on that when I'm securing this into place to my existing framing. So along the top, measure across, find 2 3/16, and make a little reference line right there. Do the same thing at the bottom. Again, 2 3/16, little reference line right there. All right, now I'm gonna make the same reference marks on my other side so I have my leading edge nailer ready to go. Once I'm ready, I find it easiest to preload a couple screws onto the back of the nailer. Then I'm gonna take it up, hold it into position, and then you can come down low here and kind of take a look at this, making sure again, the bottom of my nailer is sitting 1 inch off of my tub flange here. Again, 5/8 if you're doing it on a shower. And then I can also keep an eye on my lower reference mark here, making sure I'm getting 2 3/16 of an inch off of my existing framing. I'm gonna go ahead and secure 1 screw here down low. And then once that's in place, I can come up top and check that top reference mark and secure that in place. Once I have my first one in place, I'll take the second one, that's its twin, put it right on the back, again, making sure everything's nice and flush to the front and on the top, and then we'll be able to move on to the other side. So go ahead and get everything marked and cut. Let's secure those into place, and then come back here and move on to the next step. Now that we have all of our blocking and our rough framing in place, we can move on to dry fitting our wall set. What this means is basically putting the wall set into the alcove to check for final alignment without fully securing it into place. Now we could totally do that for the back panel and the side panel without the plumbing at this point. However, for the side panel that does have the plumbing, we can't do that just yet because our panel will come in contact with our mixing valve and our spout here and won't allow us to push it all the way back to the framing and check for that final alignment. So the next step of the install is going to basically be drilling holes into our side panel to accommodate the mixing valve and the spout. Now it's really important that I stress this point is we're only going to get 1 shot at drilling these holes in the correct location and size on our side panel that's getting the plumbing. So be very careful to make sure you're taking great measurements and being very accurate about the position and size of the holes we're going to be drilling. Now as a bit of a pro tip is I like to confirm those measurements as much as possible, so we're going to do a dry run using a cardboard template first to make sure everything's looking great before we drill the holes into the side panel for real. Now to determine the location of the holes we're going to need to drill, there's going to be 2 measurements we're going to take. The first is a horizontal measurement off a line that's plumb with the front edge of our tub here, and the second is a vertical measurement off of the deck of the tub to the center of both the mixing valve and the spout. And the intersection of those 2 points will give me the center point of the holes I need to drill for my mixing valve and my spout. So for the horizontal measurement, I'm going to take my tape measure and a level. I'm going to hold my level tight to the front edge of my tub here, and then check to make sure it's plumb. Now for me here, I'm tight with my door nailer, so I'm going to take my measuring tape, hold it to the back side of that level, and then make note of the measurement to the center of the spout, and also to the center of my mixing valve. Next, I'm gonna take the measurements for the vertical center points. Again, I'm coming off the deck of my tub, not the flange. So I wanna make sure my tape is contacting the deck of the tub. And I'm gonna make note of the two measurements, one to the center of the spout, and the other to the center of the mixing valve. All right, now that I know what the horizontal measurements and the vertical measurements are, I'll know the center points of the two holes that I need to be drilling into my side panel. Now again, like I mentioned before, I think it's a great idea to do a test run using a cardboard template. So what I have here is a big piece of cardboard, and I've put an arrow on it to mark which way is up and also which way is the front. Also, I need to make sure that my front edge here is perfectly straight and is square to the bottom edge here as well. And then also, if you look down at the corner here, I've also made a little bit of a notch here that will help my template sit tight to the tub deck and also accommodate this little water dam here that's on the front edge of my tub. So what I want to do is set my template in place, checking to make sure that the bottom is flat against the tub deck, and then lining it up with the front edge of my tub here. At this point, what I'm going to do is go ahead and transfer my two measurements against my center point of where that hole for the spout needs to be, and then the center point of where that mixing valve needs to be, and then go ahead and drill my two test holes to check the alignment of how I've measured everything out here. Now the size of the holes is going to depend on the rough fixtures in your application at home that you've chosen. Now what we want to do is making sure that we drill a hole that's large enough to obviously accommodate the fixture, but not so large that it would cause an issue when you go to install your finished trim, so just be sure to keep that in mind. Okay, with all that said, let's take a moment to go ahead and cut those holes in our template. We'll come back here to check final alignment and then be ready to move on. All right, I've got the holes drilled in my template, so now we can check for final alignment. So just like before, I'm gonna take my template, making sure it's sitting flush onto the deck of the tub here, and then push it back into place. Double checking that the leading edge of the template is both plumb and flush with the leading edge of my tub. And then I like to take a little bit of a step back just to double check both the center point and also the hole size for both the spout and the mixing valve. Everything's looking great with our template, so now we have confidence that those same measurements are gonna work perfectly on our side panel. So once you're ready, let's remove the template. We'll hop back out and start transferring those measurements over to our side panel and get those holes drilled.
All right, we've got our side panel up on sawhorses, and the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have the correct panel. So we're going to drill holes in our left panel. So I've made sure that this is the left side because it has this smooth edge here, which is going to be our outside edge, and it's going to go right here. I also want to make sure I know which side is the top and the bottom. So I know that this is the bottom because it's the shortest side with no flange on it. We also want to make sure that our panel is facing up. All right, now it's time to transfer our measurements. And it's really helpful to have two people for this step, and I'll show you why. So grab your tape measure. We're gonna place it on the bottom edge here and extend your tape measure all the way across to the top. And we're gonna keep it level, just like that. And then the second person is gonna get a bird's eye view and look directly down and transfer that measurement.
Now the reason it's important that the tape measure remains level is because we're trying to get as accurate a measurement as we can. If you're holding this tape measure flat on the ground here, you see you might throw off your measurement a little bit because that tape measure is at an angle to the surface that we're going to be drilling into. So again, with Hannah holding it level, I'm going to get my eye right up over the top as best I can, and then transfer those measurements for the vertical height of the spout and also the mixing valve right down onto my panel. Now we're gonna do the same thing for the horizontal, again, making sure we're measuring off the front edge of our panel here. Again, making sure our tape measure is level. Get your eye up above there, and then transfer it down to the side for both your spout, and finally, your mixing valve. Okay, now that we have those two measurements transferred, I now have the center point of both my spout and my mixing valve, so I know where to drill those holes. Now again, we're only gonna get one shot at doing this correctly, so if you need to, go ahead and take a second to double check those measurements to make sure we've transferred them correctly to our side panel. Once that's done, we can move on to drilling our holes. Now, a little bit of a pro tip here is I think it's a great idea to go ahead and add a little bit of a pilot hole right at those intersections that we just marked for our spout and our mixing valve, because that will help when we come back to drill with a hole saw, make sure that hole saw stays perfectly centered over that location and drill in a perfect hole for us. So, once everything looks good, let's go ahead and move on to drilling those holes.
All right, we've gone ahead and dry fit a couple of our panels into place. So we have our bottom rear panel dry fit in, and we know that this is the bottom because it's the one without any shelves on it. We also have our right side panel dry fit into place. Now we're gonna do our left side panel. And before we do that, if you have a plaster guard and it looks like it might get in the way, you can go ahead and remove it and discard it. Now we're gonna grab our left side panel and guide it into the corner and over our tub spout and our mixing valve. Once we get it guided into the corner, we can kind of apply some pressure to that outside edge and it should click into place.
Now there's one final alignment piece that I want to make sure we keep an eye out for while we have these 3 panels dry fit into our alcove. Again, I'm checking to make sure that my side panel and my lower rear panel are snapped tightly together and the front edge of my side panel is even with the front edge of my tub. Once everything looks good there, I want to double check to see if I have any sort of gap between my lower panel here and the rough framing behind it in the corner. Now the reason I'm checking for this gap is I want to make sure if there's anything that I have to close up with a shim, because if I don't close this gap in the final installation step when we're securing our lower rear panel to the frame behind it, it's going to want to pull this panel tight to the back wall to the framing, which may make it difficult to get a tight seal between our side panel and our lower panel. So if we do have a gap, like I do here, I'm going to take my shim and gently push it into there. I'm not forcing it, just enough until it's snug. And I'm gonna make a mark so I know exactly where that shim needs to be located on the top of my flange. Just like that. And then I'm gonna also make a note on it. I'm just gonna put an L so I know this shim goes on the left-hand side of my alcove. Now I'm gonna save this for a later step during final installation and then check the other side to see if I need to make a mark for the shim on the other side as well. Once everything looks good, we can move on to marking some pilot holes.
All right, so to do that, we're gonna grab a pencil here and we're gonna mark 3 pilot holes, pilot hole reference marks at each one of our stud locations here. So I'm just gonna make a small mark here right in the center of the stud on the top of our flange here at each one of these stud locations.
All right, as Hannah finishes up marking those pilot holes, once she's done, we're gonna pull the side panels back off, leaving the lower rear panel in, snap in the upper portion of that rear panel, and then reinstall these side panels so we can do our final dry fit. Now that we have all of our panels dry fit into our alcove for the final time, we need to check some final alignment. Now the things I'm looking at specifically is first and foremost making sure that the 2 rear panels have come tightly together. Next, I also want to check to make sure that my side panels have clicked fully in and engaged with my rear panels, making sure I've got a tight seam all the way from the top to the bottom in both corners. After that, I also want to check to make sure that my wall set is sitting fully on the deck of my tub. So I'm looking for a tight and consistent gap all the way around the back and each of the sides. And finally, I think it's a great idea just to double check as well that the front edge of my wall set is perfectly in line with the front edge of my tub here, making a good consistent vertical line all the way up the wall. Once that looks good, we can move on to marking some of our final reference lines and pilot hole locations.
Yep, once you make sure your alignment is correct, you can go ahead and grab a pencil and we're gonna make some reference marks. So we're gonna make a reference mark at the top of our flange at all of our stud locations in our entire opening, and we're also gonna make a reference mark for our pilot holes. And that mark is gonna be in the center of the flange, in the center of the stud, again, at each one in our entire opening.
While Hannah finishes up those reference lines, I'm also gonna be making a couple pilot hole location marks along the front flange at each side of my wall set here. So we need to make sure we're doing a pilot hole at the top, one down towards the bottom, again, making sure that hole's in the center of the flange, then one in the middle, and then I'm gonna split the distance from the top to the middle and the bottom to the middle here, which will give me about 5 roughly evenly spaced holes all the way from the top to the bottom of my wall set. I've got this side marked, now I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side, and once we're done with all of those reference lines and all those pilot hole locations, we're gonna pull all the panels back out of the opening for the last time, drill some pilot holes, and then we'll be ready to move on to some of the final installation steps of this install. Now that we have our panels pulled back out of the opening, we can move on to drilling our pilot holes. Now I'm gonna be drilling a 3/16 of an inch hole at each one of the marked locations in the flanges that we marked earlier. And remember, there's 4 panels that we have to drill those pilot holes for. Now before I do that, I do want to point out there's an extra step for the side panel that has your plumbing in it. That's the one we cut the mixing valve hole in. For that panel, I'm gonna flip it over. And on the back side of the panel, we're gonna be adding a fire retardant pad over this mixing valve hole. So here's the pad here. You'll notice it has a felt side, and on the back side has some adhesive. When you're ready, we're gonna peel off the backing to the adhesive. And now with the sticky side down, I'm gonna do my best to perfectly center it over the mixing valve hole. I'm gonna push it down into place to make sure I'm getting good adhesion between the pad and the back of the panel. Next, we need to cut out the hole for the mixing valve. So I'm gonna take my utility knife, and I think the easiest way is to kind of make like an X in the middle and then work your knife around to cut out the rest of the pad in the hole. Just be careful with your fingers as you work your way around. Once I've got that pad in place, I'm going to flip my panel back over. And now I can move on to drilling each one of those pilot hole locations. And once you drill those pilot holes, that about wraps up the prep of the wall set itself. Next, we're going to move on to actually prepping the alcove to receive the wall set.
All right, now it's time to install our foam tape. Now this is included in your packaging, and if you were installing it on a shower base, you're only gonna install it in the 2 back corners. And you would be installing it at the top of the flange on the shower base. Now, since we're installing it on a bathtub, we're gonna be installing it at the bottom of the flange, all the way around, right above the tub deck. All right, now where we're gonna start it is 2 inches out from the edge of our tub here. So I've gone ahead and made myself a reference mark 2 inches out on both sides. 2 inches here, because this is where it's gonna end. All right, so let's go ahead and start applying this. It has an adhesive backing. So we're gonna pull that back to reveal the sticky side. And again, we're gonna start this 2 inches out from the edge of our tub here. And we're gonna apply it to the bottom of the flange, just right above the tub deck. And I'm just gonna pull off a little bit of the backing as I go. And we're gonna go right over the screws here. We wanna make sure that we really press it into the corners. Just like that. Okay, now that I'm to the end, I'm gonna grab a pair of scissors here and cut it off so that it ends right at my 2-inch reference mark. Okay, now we're ready to move on to the next step. Now it's time to install our back panel. So the first thing is, if you figured out in an earlier step that you needed to use shims, now is the time to put those in place. So you can see mine are already in. I just used a bead of adhesive on the back. And we want to put these in now because we're about to apply adhesive to these studs, and my adhesive is going to go right over the top of that shim. All right, so for the adhesive to use, you can use a quality construction adhesive that's safe for plastics. I'm actually going to use an advanced polymer hybrid sealant that'll serve as both adhesive and as a sealant. And you can tell that it's a hybrid if it says that it's safe for plastic and that it does not clean up well with water. So we're gonna apply this 4 inches down from each one of our reference marks that we made earlier, just on our back wall right now, all the way to the top of our tub flange, and also on both pieces of our blocking back here. All right, so let's go ahead and get to it.
Now that we have our adhesive in place, we can begin securing our 2 rear panels to the rear of our alcove. So I have my lower panel here, and I'm gonna slip it into place. Again, I think it's easiest to start with the side that's got the plumbing on it. Kind of find the corner against the deck of my tub, and then swing it in the rest of the way, making sure I'm centering it in my alcove. Okay, what I'm looking for here is making sure I'm getting good contact with the lower panel in the deck of my tub, all the way side to side, and then I'm generally centered left to right within my alcove. All right, perfect, this is looking great. So at this point, I'm gonna secure my lower panel in place at the 3 middle stud locations through those pilot holes that I drilled previously. Now, I do wanna talk about the screws we're gonna be using to hold this into place. They need to be 1.25 inches long, and they're truss head screws. Now the important thing with these screws is making sure that you're not using a flathead screw, because when you screw it through the flange, it could cause that flange to crack, which obviously you don't want to happen. So make sure you're using the truss head screws. Also, I'm gonna be using an extended bit holder in my drill here. And what this is gonna do is give me a little bit more leeway to make sure that the spinning chuck of my drill doesn't come in contact with my wall panel, which could cause a little bit of damage. So with all that said, once everything looks good from an alignment perspective, let's take a moment to secure this lower panel in place through those middle stud locations with our screws. With our lower panel secured into place, we can go ahead and install our top panel right on top of it. So just like before, I'm gonna lift this into place. Hannah's helping me hold it. It's gonna snap into that top channel of our lower panel. Like that. Now while she holds this in place, I'm gonna just check alignment to make sure the two panels look like they're aligning correctly in the corners, and also I'm getting good contact between the upper and the lower panel, which everything looks great. Now at this point, we have to secure the two panels to each other. There's gonna be 2 points where we can do this, one on each side in the corner here. You can see kind of inside the flange where those two panels overlap. We're gonna drill a pilot hole, again 3/16 of an inch, and then secure it into place with another one of those truss head screws. Now that we have our lower and upper rear panels fastened together with 2 screws, one in each corner where they overlap, we're also gonna hold it in place to the framing of our alcove with 3 screws in the 3 middle studs along the back wall here. Now one thing I wanna note is I'm making sure I'm not doing the ones in the corner just yet. I'm gonna wait until my side panels are in place. And also, as I do this, I wanna make sure I'm keeping an eye on that reference line I drew during the dry fit phase to make sure everything's maintaining alignment.
Now we're gonna prep our side walls for our side panels. So again, we're gonna use the same adhesive on our studs in our alcove, 4 inches down from our reference mark, all the way down to the top of our tub deck, and then also on our piece of blocking. Now there is one different step here for our side walls. We do need to apply a bead of sealant in an L shaped, and that's why I recommend using a hybrid adhesive and sealant. So we're gonna apply that 2 inches out from our tub flange here. I've made myself a little reference mark 2 inches out, and then 3 inches back from the top of the tub deck here. So go ahead and apply that L-shaped bead of sealant, apply the adhesive to both walls, and then we'll be ready to move on to installing the walls.
Now that we have our adhesive in place, we can move on to installing the side panels in our alcove. I'm gonna start with the plumbing side here. Just like during the dry fit phase, I'm gonna start by kind of getting that back corner seated with my back panel, swinging it into place, around my plumbing, over my door nailer, and then a little push to snap them together. Kind of bring it in at an angle, help it seat together with that rear panel, swinging it in, keeping an eye on that sealant at the bottom of the tub deck here, and then a little push to snap them together. All right, now that we have all of our panels into place, we can check for our final alignment just like we did during the dry fit phase. So again, I'm checking to make sure that my side panels and my rear panels are tucked tightly together in the corners. I also want to make sure that I'm getting good, even, consistent contact between my side panel, my rear panels, and along the tub deck here on all 3 sides. And also I'm checking the alignment of the wall panels themselves, here in the corners, making sure that everything's lining up, that it's even with my reference line that I drew in the earlier step, and also that the front edge of the panels here is even with the front edge of my tub. If everything's looking good, I can move on to securing the wall set in place to my rough framing using those same screws like I did before, the 1¼ inch truss head screws. And again, I'm also making sure that as I'm tightening everything into place, I'm making sure that spinning chuck of my drill isn't coming in contact with my wall set, because that could cause a little bit of damage. And finally, this time, I also want to be paying close attention to make sure that as I'm tightening things into place, I'm not pulling anything out of alignment. And this could be caused by having a little bit of a space between the flange and the rough framing behind. Come on in this corner, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So up top here, I have a little bit of space between the flange of my back wall panel and the rough framing behind. So if I was to secure this in place with a screw right now, it's going to want to pull that flange towards the rough framing, and you can see it increases that gap in the corner. So obviously I want to avoid that. So to stop that from happening, I'm going to take a shim. I'm just going to gently drop it down behind the flange there, between the flange and the rough framing. And then I can go ahead and secure that screw into place to lock everything together without pulling any of my seams apart. So just keep that in mind as you work your way around the opening. Okay, with all that said, let's take a moment to go ahead and secure our wall set into place to our rough framing, and then come back here and we'll just be about finished up with this installation. All right, we've got our wall set secured into place. We've scored and snapped off any shims we may have used, and we've also let the adhesive cure according to the manufacturer's instructions.
Now the final step of this install will actually come after your finished walls are in place. You'll need to apply a bead of sealant along the outside edge of your wall set. Now this wall set is great because you won't need to apply any sealant to the interior seams. All right, I think it looks great, and I hope the install went well for you.
If you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to the Delta Faucet customer service team. They're more than happy to help.